The sun beat down mercilessly on the parched Oklahoma territory as a single rider cut through the shimmering heat waves that rose from the dusty trail. Jackson Harlow pulled his hat lower over his eyes, scanning the horizon with a practiced gaze that had served him well in his 29 years. The year was 1887, and like many men who called this unforgiving frontier home, he had learned that vigilance often meant the difference between life and death. As he guided his chestnut stallion around a bend in the trail, something unusual caught his eye: a small covered wagon tilted precariously to one side, one wheel splintered beyond repair. But it wasn't the wagon that made Jackson spur his horse forward. It was the woman staggering beside it, her blue dress caked with dust, her movements growing increasingly unsteady with each step. "Madam," he called out, but his voice was lost in the wind. She turned slightly at the sound of approaching hoofbeats, revealing a face streaked with dirt and exhaustion. Their eyes met briefly before hers rolled back, and she collapsed in a cloud of dust. Jackson was off his horse in an instant, covering the distance between them in long strides. Kneeling beside her, he gently turned her over, noting the feverish heat emanating from her skin despite the protection of her bonnet. She was young, perhaps 23 or 24, with features that might have been striking if not marred by days of evident hardship. "Miss, can you hear me?" Jackson patted her cheek lightly, but she remained unconscious. A quick survey of the wagon revealed no companions, no driver, just a few modest trunks and supplies that spoke of someone traveling alone. No water barrel remained, explaining much about her condition. With practiced ease, Jackson lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, another worrying sign. His ranch was only a few miles away, the closest shelter for miles around. "Hang on, miss," he murmured, though he knew she couldn't hear him. With careful movements, he mounted his horse, cradling her against his chest. "I've got you now." The journey back to his ranch seemed longer than usual, each jolt of the horse's gait making Jackson worry about his unconscious charge. When the familiar silhouette of his modest homestead finally appeared on the horizon, relief washed over him. The two-story cabin he had built with his own hands stood sturdy against the backdrop of rolling prairie, flanked by a barn and corral that housed his small but respectable herd. As he approached, his ranch hand, an older man named Frank, emerged from the barn. "Jackson, what in tarnation found her collapsed on the trail?" Jackson explained quickly, dismounting carefully to avoid jostling the woman. "She needs water and rest. Quick now." Frank hurried ahead to open the door, concern etched across his weathered face. "Poor thing looks half dead from the heat." "Get Doc Miller if she doesn't improve by morning," Jackson instructed, carrying her into the house and directly to the small guest room he rarely used. The room was simple but clean, with a bed covered in a quilt Jackson's mother had made years ago. He laid the woman down gently, removing her bonnet to reveal honey-brown hair matted with sweat and dust. "Bring water, clean cloths, and whatever food we can spare that might be easy on an empty stomach," he told Frank, who nodded and disappeared to fulfill the request. Jackson dampened a cloth from his own canteen and began to clean the dust from her face. As the dirt gave way, he was struck by the delicate features revealed beneath high cheekbones, a small straight nose, and lips parched from dehydration. There was something vulnerable yet resilient about her that stirred an unfamiliar protective instinct within him. When Frank returned with the requested supplies, Jackson gently lifted the woman's head and pressed a water-soaked cloth to her lips. At first, there was no response, but after a moment, her lips parted slightly. "That's it," he encouraged softly, allowing small amounts of water to trickle into her mouth. "Easy now." After several minutes of this careful hydration, her eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes the color of summer sky. Confusion clouded her gaze as she tried to focus on his face. "Where?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "You're safe, miss. My name is Jackson Harlow. You collapsed on the trail and I brought you to my ranch. You're suffering from heat exhaustion and likely hunger too." She attempted to sit up but immediately fell back with a groan, one hand pressing against her temple. "Best lie still for now," Jackson advised. "What's your name, if you don't mind my asking?" She swallowed with difficulty. Beatrice Montgomery." "Well, Miss Montgomery, you need rest and nourishment. I've got some broth heating up for you, and there's more water here." He indicated the pitcher Frank had brought. "Do you think you could manage a few spoonfuls of broth?" Beatrice nodded weakly, and Jackson helped her to a slightly more upright position, propped against the pillows. When Frank brought in a steaming bowl of broth, Jackson dismissed him with a nod of thanks and turned his attention back to his patient. "I can feed myself," Beatrice protested feebly, attempting to reach for the spoon. Jackson raised an eyebrow at her trembling hand. "No offense intended, Miss Montgomery, but I doubt you could get that spoon to your mouth without spilling it all over yourself and my mother's quilt." A faint flush colored her cheeks. "I don't want to be a burden." "It's no burden," he replied, dipping the spoon into the broth and carefully bringing it to her lips. "You need your strength." After a moment's hesitation, she accepted the spoonful, then another. Jackson felt an unexpected satisfaction watching color gradually return to her face as she took nourishment from his own table food he had hunted, vegetables he had grown. "Thank you," she said softly after finishing half the bowl. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." Jackson set the bowl aside. "What were you doing out there alone, if you don't mind my asking? These parts aren't kind to solitary travelers, especially not women." Beatrice's eyes darkened with what appeared to be painful memories. "I was traveling to meet my uncle in Silverton. He's my only remaining family." She paused, seeming to weigh how much to share with this stranger. "My driver abandoned me 3 days ago, took the horses and most of the supplies. Said he found a better opportunity in some mining town we passed." Jackson's jaw tightened with anger at the nameless man. "That's a hanging offense, leaving a woman to die like that." "I managed for a while," she continued. "Had some water, a little food. Thought I could make it to the next settlement on foot. I miscalculated." "Indeed you did," Jackson agreed, but there was no judgment in his voice. "Well, you'll stay here until you're well enough to travel, and then I'll see about getting you safely to your uncle." Beatrice's eyes widened. "I couldn't impose, it's not an imposition," he interrupted firmly. "It's basic human decency, something your former driver was sorely lacking." She studied his face for a moment, as if trying to determine his motives. Whatever she saw there must have reassured her, because she nodded slowly. "Thank you, Mr. Harlow." "Jackson," he corrected. "If you're going to be staying under my roof, might as well use my given name." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Jackson, then, and I'm Beatrice, not Miss Montgomery." "Beatrice," he repeated, liking the way the name felt. "Rest now. We can talk more when you're stronger." As he closed the door to her room, Jackson found himself pondering the strange turn his day had taken. He had ridden out that morning a solitary rancher with only his cattle and his aging ranch hand for company. Now he had a beautiful, mysterious woman recovering in his guest room, a woman whose very presence seemed to fill a void in his home he hadn't fully acknowledged until now. Frank eyed him knowingly as he entered the kitchen. "Pretty little thing, ain't she?" Jackson shot him a warning glance. "She's a woman in distress, Frank, nothing more." "If you say so," the older man replied, not bothering to hide his skepticism. "Interesting timing, though, her showing up like this." "What do you mean?" Frank shrugged. Just that this place has been mighty quiet since your folks passed. Maybe it's time it wasn't so quiet anymore." Jackson didn't dignify that with a response, turning instead to prepare for evening chores. But as he stepped back outside into the fading light, he couldn't help but reflect on Frank's words. The ranch had indeed been too quiet these past 2 years, ever since the fever had taken both his parents within weeks of each other. At 29, he had grown accustomed to solitude, convinced himself he preferred it even. Yet something about Beatrice Montgomery's presence under his roof stirred long-dormant feelings, a reminder of what a home should feel like, filled with more than just the echoes of his own footsteps. Shaking off such uncharacteristically sentimental thoughts, Jackson headed toward the barn. He had a ranch to run, and moon-eyed musings over a woman he'd just met would accomplish nothing. Still, he found himself quickening his evening chores, eager to return to the house where she rested. When dawn broke the following morning, Jackson was already up, having slept fitfully. Concern for his guest had him checking on her twice during the night, each time finding her sleeping peacefully. Her breathing steady and her color improved. Now, as he prepared a simple breakfast of flapjacks and bacon, he heard the floorboards creak. Turning, he was surprised to see Beatrice standing in the doorway, one hand braced against the frame for support. "You shouldn't be up," he admonished, moving quickly to offer his arm. "I've imposed enough," she replied, though she accepted his support, "and I'm feeling much better this morning." Looking at her more closely, Jackson had to admit she did look improved. Her hair had been combed and pinned up, though less elaborately than fashion might dictate, and she had clearly used water from the basin in her room to wash away the remaining dust from her face and hands. She was wearing the same blue dress, somewhat wrinkled but brushed clean. "You're not imposing," he said, guiding her to a chair at the table, "and you're still weak. Sit. Eat." He placed a plate before her, noting how her eyes widened at the generous portion. "This is too much, food's plentiful here," he interrupted. "One of the benefits of ranch life. Eat what you can." Beatrice looked up at him with an expression that suggested she wasn't accustomed to such direct commands but found them oddly refreshing. "Do you always order people around at your breakfast table, Jackson?" A smile tugged at his lips despite himself. "Only those who need ordering around, Beatrice." She laughed then, a genuine sound that transformed her face and struck Jackson with unexpected force. She was beautiful when she laughed, not in the delicate, porcelain doll way of society women he'd occasionally encountered in town, but with a vitality that seemed to illuminate her from within. "Well," she said, cutting into a flapjack, "since you've gone to the trouble of cooking, I suppose I should oblige." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Beatrice spoke again. "May I ask how far we are from Silverton?" Jackson considered the question. "By wagon, with good weather and no delays, about 2 weeks' journey. Longer if the creeks are running high from the recent rains." Her face fell slightly, though she tried to hide her disappointment. "I see. My uncle is expecting me. He'll worry if I don't arrive." "Is there a way to get word to him, perhaps? He works as an assayer at the silver mine there. A telegram might reach him." Jackson nodded. "I'll ride into town tomorrow, send a wire for you." "You're very kind," Beatrice said softly. "Kinder than I had any right to expect from a stranger." Something in her tone suggested she'd had reason to expect otherwise from the men she'd encountered, and Jackson felt a renewed surge of anger toward her absent driver. "Not all men are like the coward who abandoned you," he said. "No," she agreed, meeting his gaze directly. "Clearly they are not." The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither was prepared to acknowledge. Finally, Jackson cleared his throat and stood, breaking the spell. "If you're feeling up to it after breakfast, I could show you around the ranch." Nothing too strenuous, just the house and nearby buildings. Beatrice's face brightened. I'd like that very much. I've never been on a working ranch before. Where are you from originally? He asked, realizing how little he knew about her. St. Louis, she replied. My father was a bookkeeper for a shipping company. After he died last winter, there was little reason to stay. Something in her carefully chosen words suggested there was more to the story, but Jackson didn't press. And your uncle in Silverton, he invited you to join him. She nodded. He suggested I might find opportunities there. Teaching, perhaps. I was educated at a ladies' seminary. Jackson tried to imagine this woman in the rough mining town of Silverton, with its saloons and brothels outnumbering proper establishments 3-to-1. The image didn't sit well with him. Silverton's a rough place, he said cautiously. Not much call for ladies' seminary education there, I wouldn't think. Beatrice's chin lifted slightly. I'm not afraid of hard work or rough conditions, Jackson, and I have few alternatives. The quiet dignity in her voice impressed him. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. Just wanted you to know what you might be facing. Her expression softened. I appreciate your concern, but I've learned that life rarely unfolds as we expect. We must simply adapt to what comes. There was wisdom in her words that seemed beyond her years, and Jackson found himself curious about what experiences had taught her such a lesson. Well, he said, rising from the table, if you're finished, I'll show you around. Frank's likely got the coffee ready in the cookhouse by now. He'll be pleased to meet you properly. Frank was indeed pleased, his weathered face breaking into a wide smile as Jackson introduced Beatrice. The old ranch hand made a gallant attempt at a bow that made her laugh again, that same melodious sound that seemed to brighten the very air around her. Madam, it's a genuine pleasure, Frank said, offering her a cup of coffee. Been telling Jackson for years this place needs a woman's touch. Jackson shot him a warning glance, but Beatrice merely smiled. It's a lovely home already, though I'm grateful for the hospitality. Been in the Harlow family 3 generations now, Frank informed her proudly, as though he himself were a Harlow. In many ways, he was family, having worked for Jackson's grandfather and then his father before him. Jackson's made it even finer than his daddy did, adding that second story and the new barn. You built it yourself? Beatrice asked, looking at Jackson with new interest. He shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. Had help with the raising, but yes, I designed it. Wanted something that would last. It's impressive, she said sincerely. You must be very proud of what you've built here. Something in her genuine admiration touched him. Most women he'd encountered, the few who occasionally passed through these parts, or the town's eligible daughters paraded before him at social gatherings, seemed to regard ranching as a crude profession, necessary but hardly worthy of respect. It's a good life, he said simply. Hard sometimes, but good. The morning passed pleasantly as Jackson showed Beatrice around the immediate vicinity of the ranch house. She displayed genuine interest in everything from the vegetable garden behind the house to the smithy where Jackson shoed his own horses. By midday, however, he could see fatigue setting in, her steps becoming slower and her face paler. That's enough for today, he said firmly. You need to rest. She started to protest but swayed slightly on her feet, confirming his assessment. Without ceremony, Jackson swept her into his arms for the second time in as many days. This is becoming a habit, Beatrice remarked, her voice betraying a mixture of embarrassment and amusement. Can't have you fainting in the dust again, he replied, carrying her easily back toward the house. Once was enough. I am perfectly capable of walking, she insisted, though she made no effort to struggle against his hold. I'm sure you are, when you're not recovering from nearly dying of thirst and exhaustion. His tone was gruff, but his arms were gentle as he carried her up the porch steps and through the door. Inside the cool interior of the house, he set her down carefully on the sofa in the small parlor rather than taking her directly to her bedroom. Somehow that seemed too intimate a gesture now that she was conscious. "Rest here," he instructed. "I'll bring you some water and lunch when it's ready." Beatrice looked up at him, her blue eyes searching his face. "Why are you doing all this, Jackson? You could have simply left me in town, or with neighbors closer to where you found me." The question caught him off guard. Why indeed? The simple answer that it was the right thing to do didn't quite capture the whole truth. "I suppose," he said slowly, "it's because I know what it's like to be alone in the world. When my parents died, having Frank here, having somewhere I belonged made all the difference." He paused, feeling he'd revealed more than he intended. "Besides, there aren't any neighbors for miles in the direction I found you." She accepted this explanation with a nod, though her gaze remained thoughtful. "Well, whatever your reasons, I'm grateful, truly." Jackson found himself suddenly uncomfortable under the intensity of her gaze. "I should see to the cattle," he said abruptly. "Frank will be within earshot if you need anything before I return." He retreated from the house, unsettled by the strange emotions this woman stirred in him. Attraction. Certainly he wasn't dead after all, and Beatrice Montgomery was undeniably beautiful. But there was something more, something he couldn't quite name that made him simultaneously want to be near her and keep his distance. Out in the pasture, checking on a pregnant heifer, Jackson tried to make sense of his conflicted feelings. It had been a long time since he'd allowed himself to think of a woman as anything more than a passing acquaintance. His life was here, on this land, with responsibilities that left little room for courtship or marriage. Yet he couldn't deny that Beatrice's presence had awakened something long dormant within him, a reminder that his careful, solitary existence might not be all life had to offer. "Fool," he muttered to himself. "She's here by circumstance, not choice, and she's bound for Silverton as soon as she's well enough to travel." Still, as he made his way back to the house hours later, he found himself taking extra care with his appearance, washing the dust from his face and hands at the pump, and running fingers through his dark hair in a futile attempt to tame it. Inside, he found Beatrice not resting as he'd instructed, but seated at the kitchen table with Frank, peeling potatoes with practiced efficiency. "What's this?" he asked, trying and failing to keep the disapproval from his voice. Beatrice looked up, a challenge in her eyes. "This is me earning my keep, Mr. Harlow. I told you to rest. And I did for a time, but I'm not an invalid, nor am I accustomed to idleness." She continued peeling, her movements deft and quick. "Frank has been kind enough to let me help with dinner preparations." Frank, the trader, merely shrugged at Jackson's glare. Lady wanted to help, didn't see the harm in it. "There's harm if she exhausts herself and ends up worse than before," Jackson argued. Beatrice set down her paring knife with deliberate calm. "I appreciate your concern, truly. But I assure you, peeling potatoes while seated at a table is well within my current capabilities." Her voice softened slightly. "Please, Jackson, I need to feel useful." Something in her plea resonated with him. Hadn't he thrown himself into work after his parents' deaths, needing the physical labor to keep his grief at bay? Perhaps her need to be active came from a similar place, a way to maintain control when life had proven how little control one actually had. "Fine," he conceded. "But if you start feeling faint again, I'll sit down immediately," she promised, then added with a slight smile, "Oh wait, I'm already sitting." Frank chuckled, and after a moment Jackson found himself smiling too, recognizing the gentle teasing for what it was. There was spirit in this woman, despite all she'd been through. "Just don't overdo it," he said. his tone gentler now. The domestic scene before him, Frank and Beatrice working companionably in the kitchen that had been too empty for too long, stirred something profound in Jackson's chest. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine this not as a temporary arrangement, but as something permanent, a home filled with conversation and laughter again, with someone to share both the burdens and joys of ranch life. The thought was as appealing as it was dangerous. Beatrice was passing through his life, not setting down roots. To forget that would only lead to disappointment. Yet as they sat down to dinner that evening, the meal made more appetizing by Beatrice's contributions, Jackson found it increasingly difficult to remember that this was temporary. There was something about her that fit here, that complemented the life he had built, in a way he wouldn't have thought possible. Their conversation flowed easily, covering everything from books they had read to childhood memories. Beatrice, it turned out, had a quick wit and a surprising knowledge of topics ranging from literature to basic botany, the latter learned from her mother's extensive garden in St. Louis. "I've been thinking," Jackson said as they finished the apple cobbler Frank had proudly produced for dessert. "Your wagon, we should salvage what we can from it tomorrow. Your belongings, at least." Beatrice's expression brightened. "I would appreciate that. There isn't much, but what there is holds sentimental value. My mother's locket, some books, a few photographs." "We'll ride out first thing in the morning if you're up to it," Jackson decided. "Should be cooler then and we can be back before the worst heat of the day." "I'd like that," she said, then hesitated. "Though I'm not much of a rider." Jackson considered this. "We could take the buckboard, but it's slower. Or you could ride with me on Jupiter." Frank made a suspiciously cough-like sound that Jackson ignored. "I think I'd prefer riding with you," Beatrice admitted. "If it's not too much trouble, the buckboard looks rather bouncy." "It is that," Jackson agreed, ignoring the implications of having her pressed against him for the hour-long ride. "We'll leave after breakfast then." That night, as he lay in his bed listening to the familiar sounds of the prairie night, Jackson found himself oddly restless. The woman sleeping down the hall had upended his carefully ordered existence in just 2 days. What might happen if she stayed longer? And why did that prospect both excite and terrify him? Morning came with a clear sky that promised another scorching day ahead. Jackson was already up and dressed when he heard movement from Beatrice's room, followed by her appearance in the kitchen. She had managed to refresh her appearance remarkably well given her limited possessions, and had fashioned her honey-brown hair into a simple but becoming style. "Good morning," she greeted him, a touch of shyness in her manner that hadn't been present the day before. Perhaps she too had been thinking about their planned ride together. "Morning," he replied, pouring her a cup of coffee. "Sleep well." "Very well, thank you." "Your home is so peaceful at night, just the wind and the distant sounds of animals. It's soothing." Jackson nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "City folks sometimes find it too quiet, but to me, it's never really silent, just a different kind of music than town provides." Beatrice smiled at his poetic observation. "I think I prefer your music to the city's." They ate breakfast quickly, both aware of the rising temperature outside. When they finished, Jackson led her to the barn where Jupiter, his chestnut stallion, was already saddled and waiting. "He's magnificent," Beatrice said, approaching the horse cautiously. "And he knows it," Jackson replied with affection, patting the horse's neck. "Most gentle-natured stallion I've ever known, though. He'll behave himself." He showed her how to approach and let Jupiter become accustomed to her scent before helping her mount. Once she was settled in the saddle, he swung up behind her in one fluid motion, his arms coming around her to take the reins. The intimacy of their position wasn't lost on either of them. Jackson could feel the tension in Beatrice's back where it pressed against his chest, could smell the faint lavender scent that somehow clung to her despite her limited toiletries. "Comfortable?" he asked, his voice coming out rougher than intended. "Yes," she answered, a slight tremor in her voice betraying her awareness of him. "Though it's been some time since I rode." "Just relax and move with the horse," he advised, urging Jupiter forward with a gentle pressure of his knees. "He'll do all the work." As they rode away from the ranch, Jackson was acutely conscious of every point where their bodies touched her back against his chest, her hips between his thighs, her hands occasionally brushing his where they rested on the reins. It was both torment and pleasure, and he found himself torn between wishing the journey longer and praying for it to end quickly before he embarrassed himself. Beatrice seemed to relax gradually as they rode, her body becoming more pliant against his, moving in rhythm with the horse's gait. When they crested a small rise and the endless prairie spread out before them, painted in hues of gold and green under the morning sun, she gasped in appreciation. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice full of wonder. "So vast and wild." "That it is," Jackson agreed, though he found his gaze drawn not to the familiar landscape but to the profile of the woman before him, her face lifted to the endless sky. "Takes a certain kind of person to love it here. Many find it too empty, too harsh." "I don't find it empty at all," she replied thoughtfully. "Just spacious, room to breathe, room to be." Her words resonated with his own feelings about this land, surprising him. Few people, especially those city-bred, understood the appeal of the open prairie. They rode in companionable silence for a time, the rhythm of the horse's hooves and the whisper of the wind through the tall grass the only sounds. When they finally approached the site where Jackson had found her, Beatrice stiffened slightly in his arms. "It's strange," she said quietly. "I remember so little of that moment. Just the dust, the thirst, and then you." Jackson tightened his arms around her instinctively, a protective gesture he wasn't fully conscious of making. "Well, the wagon's still here at least. Doesn't look like anyone's disturbed it." He helped her dismount, steadying her when her legs wobbled slightly after the long ride. The broken wagon stood as they had left it, tilting sadly to one side, a testament to interrupted journeys and changed plans. Beatrice approached it slowly, running her hand along the weathered wood of the wagon cover. "It wasn't much, but it was to be my fresh start. We'll get your belongings," Jackson promised, "and we'll figure out the rest." Together they salvaged what they could from the wagon, her trunks containing clothing and personal items, books wrapped carefully in cloth, a small writing desk that had belonged to her father. Jackson secured everything to Jupiter's saddle or carried it himself, impressed by how little she had brought to start her new life. As they prepared to leave, Beatrice stood looking at the abandoned wagon one last time. "Should we burn it?" she asked practically. "It seems wrong to leave it here for someone else to salvage." Jackson considered the question. "We could, though the wood might be useful to someone truly in need, but you're right, better not to leave it as a lure for scavengers." They compromised by removing anything of potential value, the remaining good wheel, some of the metal fittings, the canvas cover, and loaded these onto Jupiter as well. The horse bore the additional burden stoically, though Jackson knew they would need to travel more slowly on the return journey. The ride back was indeed slower, and required them to stop once to rest the horse and rearrange their load. During this break, they sat in the shade of a lone cottonwood tree, sharing water from Jackson's canteen. "Tell me about your uncle," Jackson said, curious about the man Beatrice was traveling so far to reach. She took a sip of water before answering. "Uncle William is my father's younger brother. He left St. Louis years ago, seeking his fortune in the silver mines. He writes infrequently, but his last letter mentioned the need for a teacher in Silverton, the previous one having left to get married. She paused. He's a good man, though I haven't seen him since I was a child. When Father died and the creditors took our home, he was the only family member who offered help. Jackson noted the careful way she referenced her father's death and the loss of their home. There was more to that story, he was certain, but he didn't press. "And you're sure Silverton is where you want to be?" he asked instead. "There are other towns, other opportunities that might suit you better." Beatrice studied him for a moment. "Are you suggesting I have alternatives I haven't considered, just making an observation?" "Silverton's a mining town, rough around the edges. A woman alone." "A woman alone must make her way as best she can," she finished for him, a touch of steel entering her voice. "I have few illusions about what awaits me there, Jackson, but I have even fewer options." The resignation in her tone bothered him more than he cared to admit. Before he could respond, however, she continued in a lighter voice. "Besides, I'm not without skills. I can teach, so keep accounts. I'm not afraid of hard work." "I never suggested you were," Jackson said. "Just that there might be places better suited to a woman of your refinement." She laughed at that, though the sound held little humor. "Refinement doesn't put food on the table or a roof over one's head. I learned that lesson when my father died." There it was again, that hint of a painful story she wasn't sharing. Jackson wanted to know more, but sensed this wasn't the time to push. "We should head back," he said instead, rising and offering her his hand. "Heat's building, and we've still got a ways to go." The remainder of the journey passed in relative silence, both lost in their own thoughts. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was high overhead and Beatrice was clearly exhausted, though she tried to hide it. Frank emerged from the cookhouse as they rode in, hurrying over to help unload the salvaged items. "Looks like you had some success," he observed, eyeing the pile of belongings. "Everything that mattered," Beatrice confirmed, allowing Jackson to help her down from the horse. Her legs buckled slightly as she touched the ground, and he kept a steadying arm around her waist. "You should rest," he told her. "We can sort through these things later." For once, she didn't argue, a testament to how truly tired she must be. Jackson escorted her to the house, concern growing as he felt her leaning more heavily against him with each step. "I'm fine," she insisted, seeing his worried expression. "Just need to sit for a moment." But as they entered the relative coolness of the house, Beatrice swayed dangerously. Jackson caught her before she could fall, sweeping her into his arms once more. "This really is becoming a habit," she murmured, her attempt at lightness undermined by the weakness in her voice. "One I'd prefer to break," he replied, carrying her to her room. "You're pushing yourself too hard." He laid her gently on the bed, pulling off her boots and drawing a light blanket over her despite the warmth of the day. Her face was pale, with 2 spots of color high on her cheekbones that worried him. "Rest," he commanded softly. "I'll bring you water and something to eat when you wake." She nodded, her eyes already closing. Jackson lingered a moment longer than necessary, watching the rise and fall of her chest, reassuring himself that she was merely exhausted, not ill. Outside her room he found Frank waiting, concern evident in the old man's weathered face. "She all right?" he asked. "Exhausted," Jackson replied. "The ride was too much, too soon after her collapse." Frank nodded sagely. "Pretty little thing's got more spirit than strength right now. Need to build her up before she tackles anything more strenuous." The casual way Frank spoke of building up Beatrice's strength, as though her stay was to be extended indefinitely, caught Jackson's attention. "She'll be moving on to Silverton once she's recovered," he reminded his ranch hand and himself. Frank merely raised an eyebrow. "If you say so, boss." Jackson chose to ignore the skepticism in the older man's tone. I'm riding into town tomorrow to send a telegram to her uncle. We need supplies anyway. Whatever you say, Frank agreed, in a tone that suggested he was humoring his employer. I'll keep an eye on her while you're gone. The next morning, Jackson rose early, checking on Beatrice before he left. She was still sleeping soundly, her color better than the previous day. He left a note explaining his absence and asking her to take things easy while he was gone. The ride to town took just over 2 hours at a steady pace. Clearwater was little more than a wide spot in the trail, a general store that doubled as a post office, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a handful of other buildings strung along a dusty main street. Still, it was the closest thing to civilization for miles around, and Jackson visited about once a month for supplies and mail. At the general store, he arranged for the supplies they needed and then sent a telegram to Beatrice's uncle in Silverton, explaining the situation and assuring him of his niece's safety. Then, duty done, he found himself lingering in town longer than necessary, speaking with neighbors he encountered, and even stopping for a rare drink at the saloon. It wasn't until late afternoon that he realized he was deliberately delaying his return, as though part of him feared what might happen when Beatrice was well enough to continue her journey. The realization was unsettling enough that he immediately settled his tab and headed for Jupiter, determined to be home before dark. The sun was just beginning to set when he rode into the ranch yard, casting long shadows across the buildings and bathing everything in golden light. As he dismounted, the front door opened and Beatrice stepped onto the porch. The sight of her, framed in the doorway of his home with the setting sun turning her hair to burnished gold, struck Jackson with the force of a physical blow. She was wearing one of her own dresses now, a simple blue calico that complemented her eyes and had arranged her hair in a becoming style. But it was her smile, warm and welcoming, that truly arrested him. "You're back," she said, stepping forward to help him with the packages he carried. "We were beginning to worry. Got delayed in town," he explained, oddly pleased by her concern. "How are you feeling?" "Much better after a full day's rest," she assured him. "Frank kept me well fed and wouldn't let me lift a finger, though I managed to convince him I was capable of setting the table for dinner." Jackson smiled at the image of his gruff ranch hand fussing over Beatrice. "He means well." "He's very kind," she agreed. "As are you. Was the telegram sent?" "It was. Your uncle should receive it tomorrow or the next day, depending on conditions." They entered the house together, the domesticity of the moment not lost on Jackson. It felt natural to have her here, helping him unpack supplies, moving around his kitchen with growing familiarity. "I got some things for you in town," he said, a bit gruffly, pulling a small package from one of the larger bundles. "Just some necessities I thought you might need." Beatrice accepted the package with surprise. Opening it, she found a hairbrush, a small mirror, a cake of lavender soap, and a pot of salve for her sun-chapped skin. "Jackson," she said softly, clearly touched by the thoughtful gifts. "This is so kind. You must let me repay you." "No need," he insisted. "Small things." But they weren't small to her, he could see that in her eyes. They were evidence that someone had thought about her comfort, her needs. Had it been so long since anyone had done that for her? Frank joined them for dinner, and the three ate together companionably, the older man entertaining them with stories of the early days of ranching in the territory. Jackson noticed how Beatrice drew Frank out, asking questions that showed genuine interest and laughing at his colorful descriptions of frontier mishaps. After dinner, Frank excused himself, heading back to his small cabin near the barn with a knowing wink at Jackson that the younger man pretended not to see. Left alone with Beatrice in the parlor, Jackson found himself uncharacteristically nervous. Would you care to sit outside for a while?" He suggested. "The evenings are usually pleasant, even after the hottest days." Beatrice nodded and they moved to the porch, settling into the two rocking chairs that faced west across the prairie. The sunset had faded, leaving behind a deep blue sky scattered with emerging stars. "It's beautiful here," Beatrice said after a comfortable silence. "So peaceful." Jackson followed her gaze across his land, seeing it anew through her eyes. "It is, though it can be harsh, 2 blizzards in winter, drought in summer. The land demands respect. Like the sea," she observed. "Beautiful but unforgiving of mistakes." "You've seen the ocean," she nodded. "Once, as a child. My father took us to the Gulf Coast. I remember being terrified and fascinated in equal measure." The casual mention of her family provided an opening Jackson had been waiting for. "You haven't spoken much about your life before," he noted. "In St. Louis." Beatrice was silent for so long he thought she might not answer. When she did, her voice was carefully controlled. "There isn't much to tell that would interest you, a ordinary life until it wasn't." "I'm interested," he said simply. She glanced at him as if gauging his sincerity, then looked back at the darkening landscape. "My father was a bookkeeper for a shipping company. My mother died when I was 16, consumption. It was just the two of us after that." She paused. "Father wasn't practical about money. He provided well while he was employed, but he saved little. When he took ill last winter, there were no reserves to draw upon." Jackson listened quietly, sensing there was more. "After he died, I discovered he had borrowed extensively, gambling debts mainly. The creditors took everything, including our home." Her voice remained steady, but he could hear the effort it cost her. "I had been teaching at a small girls' school, but the position paid barely enough for a single room. When Uncle William wrote suggesting I come to Silverton, it seemed the best option." "I'm sorry," Jackson said. Inadequate words for the losses she had endured. Beatrice shrugged slightly. "Many have suffered worse. At least I had education and skills to fall back on. And family, however distant, willing to help." Her resilience impressed him deeply. Here was a woman who had lost everything and yet faced her uncertain future with courage and dignity. "Still," he said, "it couldn't have been easy, leaving everything familiar behind." "There was little familiar left to leave," she replied with a sad smile. "And sometimes a fresh start is what one needs." They fell silent again, watching as the stars multiplied across the vast canvas of the sky. Jackson found himself wanting to offer her something: comfort, security, a place where she might belong, but uncertain how such an offer would be received. "And you?" Beatrice asked eventually. "Have you always lived here?" "Born and raised," he confirmed. "3rd generation on this land. My grandfather staked the claim, built the first cabin. My father expanded it, added more grazing land. I've tried to build on what they started. Your parents must be proud of what you've accomplished." "They would be, I hope," he said, the familiar ache of loss a dull throb now rather than the sharp pain it had once been. "They died 2 years ago. Fever took them both within weeks of each other." Beatrice turned to him, genuine sympathy in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Jackson." To lose them both so close together must have been devastating. "It was," he acknowledged. "For a time I wasn't sure I wanted to continue here without them. The place felt empty, but you stayed. This land is in my blood," he explained. "And there's a responsibility that comes with it to the people who depend on me, like Frank, and to the legacy my family built. Couldn't just walk away from that." Beatrice nodded in understanding. "That sense of duty speaks well of you. Many would have sold and sought an easier path." Her approval warmed him in a way few things had in recent years. They continued talking as the night deepened around them, sharing stories of their childhoods, their dreams, their disappointments. Jackson found himself revealing thoughts he had never articulated to anyone about his hopes for the ranch, his occasional loneliness, his deep connection to the land that sustained him. In turn, Beatrice spoke of her love of teaching, her passion for books, her desire to make a meaningful contribution despite the limited options available to women of her time. There was an intelligence and thoughtfulness to her that Jackson found increasingly captivating. It wasn't until the moon was high overhead that they realized how late it had grown. "We should go in," Jackson said reluctantly. "Tomorrow comes early on a ranch." Beatrice rose, but paused before entering the house. "Thank you for listening," she said softly. "It's been a long time since I've had someone to really talk with." "Same here," he admitted. In the doorway, she turned to face him, their bodies close in the narrow space. For a moment, Jackson hoped she might lean toward him, but instead she simply smiled and whispered, "Good night, Jackson." "Good night, Beatrice," he replied, watching as she moved down the hallway to her room, feeling as though something profound had shifted between them during those hours under the stars. The following days fell into a pleasant rhythm. Beatrice regained her strength rapidly, insisting on contributing to the household by cooking meals, mending clothes, and even helping in the vegetable garden behind the house. Jackson found himself lingering over breakfast, returning to the house for the midday meal when he normally would have eaten a cold lunch in the fields, and hurrying through afternoon chores to be back for dinner. Frank observed these changes with poorly concealed amusement, but said nothing beyond an occasional knowing glance that Jackson studiously ignored. The truth was, he wasn't ready to examine too closely the growing feelings Beatrice stirred in him. To do so would mean acknowledging that her eventual departure would leave a void far greater than he was prepared to face. A week after sending the telegram, a response arrived from Silverton. Jackson brought it back from town, handing it to Beatrice with a carefully neutral expression that belied the dread he felt. She read it quickly, her face showing relief, and then something more complicated. "Uncle William is glad to know I'm safe," she reported. "He says the teaching position is still available and to come when I'm able." She hesitated, then added, "He also says there's no great hurry as the school term doesn't begin for another month." Jackson tried not to show his relief at this reprieve. "Well, that's good news. Gives you more time to fully recover before undertaking the journey." "Yes," she agreed, though something in her tone suggested she was wrestling with her own conflicted feelings. "I should repay your hospitality by helping more around the ranch while I'm here." "You've already been a tremendous help," he assured her. "Frank says your cooking alone is worth whatever trouble you might be, which is high praise indeed from him." She laughed, the sound as delightful to him now as it had been the first time he heard it. "Frank is too kind." "But I mean it, Jackson. I don't want to be a burden." "You're not," he said firmly. "Having you here has been." He searched for the right word, one that wouldn't reveal too much of his growing attachment. "Pleasant." "Pleasant," she repeated, and he could have sworn there was a hint of disappointment in her voice. "Well, I'm glad I haven't been too much of an imposition." Before he could clarify to explain that "pleasant" was a woeful understatement for the joy her presence had brought to his home, they were interrupted by Frank calling from outside about a problem with one of the horses. The moment passed, and Jackson found himself once again tongue-tied when it came to expressing his deepening feelings for Beatrice. She was a lady, educated and refined despite her recent hardships. What could he offer her that would compare to the opportunities awaiting her in Silverton or beyond? Yet as the days passed, he became increasingly aware of the way her eyes followed him when she thought he wasn't looking, the slight flush that colored her cheeks when their hands accidentally touched, the way she sought his company even when there was no practical reason to do so. These signs gave him hope that perhaps his feelings weren't entirely one-sided. 2 weeks after her arrival at the ranch, Jackson decided to host a small gathering, something he hadn't done since his parents' passing. The nearest neighbors, the Thompsons, lived 5 miles away, with 3 daughters around Beatrice's age. He thought she might enjoy female company for a change, and secretly hoped that seeing him through others' eyes might somehow enhance her opinion of him. When he suggested the idea, Beatrice's face lit up with enthusiasm. "That would be wonderful. I'd love to meet your neighbors. Not much in the way of society out here," he cautioned. "Just simple folk making a living off the land." "The best kind of people," she replied sincerely. "When shall we have them?" The "we" did not escape his notice, nor the way she immediately began planning what they might serve and how to prepare the house for company. It struck him how naturally she had stepped into the role of mistress of his home, and how right it felt to have her there. The day of the gathering arrived, and Jackson found himself unusually nervous as he dressed in his best shirt, one that had rarely seen use since his mother had made it for him 2 Christmases past. When he emerged from his room, he found Beatrice in the kitchen, putting final touches on a berry pie that filled the house with a mouth-watering aroma. She had dressed carefully as well, wearing a green dress he hadn't seen before, her hair arranged in a more elaborate style than usual. The sight of her, domestic and beautiful in his kitchen, hit him with the force of revelation. This was what he wanted, not just for today, but for all his tomorrows. "You look nice," he said, the words inadequate for what he truly felt. Beatrice turned, a smile lighting her face. "Thank you." "So do you. That blue brings out your eyes." The simple compliment pleased him far more than it should have. "Need any help with the preparations?" "Everything's under control," she assured him. "Frank's been invaluable. He's setting up tables outside under the cottonwood." The Thompsons arrived mid-afternoon, John and Martha, with their daughters Emma, Sarah, and young Lucy. They greeted Jackson warmly and looked with undisguised curiosity at Beatrice, whom Jackson introduced simply as Miss Montgomery, who's staying with us for a time. Martha Thompson, a practical woman with a kind face weathered by years of prairie life, took to Beatrice immediately. "So lovely to meet you, dear. We've been curious ever since Frank mentioned Jackson had a house guest." The knowing look she cast between Beatrice and Jackson made him realize that Frank had likely shared more than just the basic facts of Beatrice's presence at the ranch. Small communities thrived on such information, and he could practically see the speculation in Martha's eyes. The afternoon passed pleasantly, with a hearty meal served at tables set beneath the spreading branches of the old cottonwood tree. Jackson found himself repeatedly glancing at Beatrice, admiring the easy way she conversed with the Thompson girls, the genuine interest she showed in Martha's description of their small orchard, the respectful attention she paid to John's stories of the early days in the territory. She belonged here, he thought. Not just at his ranch, but in this life, this community of hardworking people who valued honesty, resilience, and neighborliness above the social niceties of city life. After the meal, John pulled Jackson aside under the pretense of examining a new colt in the corral. "Fine woman, that Miss Montgomery," he commented, his tone casual but his eyes shrewd. "She is," Jackson agreed cautiously. "Martha thinks you've got intentions there." Jackson felt heat rise in his face. "It's not. She's on her way to Silverton to stay with her uncle." John raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? Seems mighty comfortable here already." "She needed time to recover after I found her collapsed on the trail," Jackson explained. "Her driver abandoned her, left her to die out there." "Shameful," John agreed with genuine indignation. "But fortunate for you, I'd say." "How do you mean?" the older man chuckled. Come now, Jackson. I've known you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper, never seen you look at a woman the way you look at her. And unless I'm losing my eyesight along with my hair, she looks at you the same way. Jackson stared at his neighbor, hope and uncertainty warring within him. You think so? I know so. Martha spotted it the minute we arrived. John clapped him on the shoulder. Question is, what are you going to do about it? It was a question Jackson had been avoiding for days. What could he offer Beatrice that would compare with the wider world she might experience elsewhere? A hard-working life on an isolated ranch was not what most women dreamed of. I don't know if this life would be enough for her, he admitted. John looked at him thoughtfully. Maybe that's for her to decide, not you. The simple wisdom in those words stayed with Jackson for the remainder of the afternoon and into the evening, as they bid farewell to the Thompsons with promises of future visits. When he and Beatrice were finally alone, clearing away the last of the dishes as dusk settled over the land, he found himself watching her with new eyes, John's words echoing in his mind. What is it? She asked, catching him staring. Do I have flour on my face? No, he said softly. Just thinking how natural you seem here, like you belong. A flush rose in her cheeks, but she didn't look away. It feels that way to me too sometimes, like I've found a place I didn't know I was looking for. The honesty in her words gave him courage. Beatrice, I've been thinking about your plans to go to Silverton. Her hands stilled on the dish she was drying. Yes. What if he began, then faltered, uncertain how to proceed? What if there were reasons to stay? Here, I mean. She set the dish down carefully, her eyes never leaving his face. What kind of reasons, Jackson? He took a deep breath. Me. Us. What's been growing between us these past weeks? The words hung in the air between them, impossible to take back. Beatrice's expression was unreadable for a long moment, and Jackson felt his heart hammering against his ribs. I've thought about that too, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. More than I should, perhaps. And, he prompted when she didn't continue. And I'm afraid, she admitted. Afraid of trusting in something that might not be real or lasting. We've known each other such a short time under unusual circumstances. Jackson moved closer, drawn by the vulnerability in her eyes. Some things don't need years to know they're true, Beatrice. Sometimes you just know. Do you? She asked, her voice catching. No, I mean. I know that before you came, this house was just a place to sleep. Now it feels like a home again. He reached for her hand, relieved when she didn't pull away. I know that the thought of you leaving makes me feel like I'm losing something precious I've only just found. Tears shimmered in her eyes, but she smiled through them. I've been telling myself it's foolish, that I'm just grateful to you for saving my life, for your kindness, that what I'm feeling isn't real. And now, he asked, hope rising in his chest. Now I'm not so sure, she confessed. When I think of leaving here, of leaving you, it feels wrong. Like I'd be walking away from something important, something true. Jackson lifted his free hand to her cheek, gently brushing away a tear that had escaped. Stay, Beatrice. Not just for now, but for good. Stay with me. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. Are you asking what I think you're asking, Jackson Harlow? I'm asking if you'll marry me, he said, the words emerging with surprising steadiness given the tumult of his emotions. If you'll make this ranch your home and me the happiest man in the territory. Beatrice's eyes widened, as though she hadn't quite expected such a direct proposal. Jackson, are you certain? I have so little to bring to a marriage, no dowry, no family connections that would benefit you. I don't want dowries or connections, he said firmly. I want you, your strength, your kindness, your laughter in this house. Everything else is just details. For a moment she said nothing, and Jackson felt a flicker of fear that he had misread everything, that she would refuse him gently but firmly. Then she smiled, a radiant expression that transformed her face and sent his heart soaring. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll stay. Yes, I'll marry you." Joy unlike anything he had ever known surged through Jackson. With a laugh of pure happiness, he pulled Beatrice into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her in a circle that made her gasp, and then laugh along with him. When he set her down, they were both breathless, faces flushed with emotion. Jackson cupped her face in his hands, looking into her eyes with all the love he felt. "May I kiss you?" he asked, suddenly shy despite the commitment they had just made to each other. In answer, Beatrice rose on tiptoe, her hands coming to rest on his shoulders, and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, a tentative exploration that quickly deepened into something more profound, as years of loneliness and weeks of growing attraction culminated in this perfect moment of connection. When they finally parted, Jackson rested his forehead against hers, unwilling to create any more distance between them than necessary. "I love you, Beatrice Montgomery. Have since the moment you opened those blue eyes and looked at me from my guest bed." She laughed softly. "Such romantic circumstances me half dead from heat exhaustion. You were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen," he insisted. "Still are," her expression sobered. "I love you too, Jackson." It happened so gradually, and yet so completely that I didn't recognize it until it was already an unchangeable fact. They might have stood there all night, holding each other and exchanging soft words and softer kisses, if not for a discreet cough from the doorway. Frank stood there, a mixture of embarrassment and satisfaction on his weathered face. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, not sounding sorry at all. "Just wanted to check if you needed help with anything else before I turn in." Jackson kept one arm firmly around Beatrice's waist as he turned to face his ranch hand. "Actually, Frank, we have some news." "Do tell," the older man replied, his eyes twinkling with foreknowledge. "Miss Montgomery has agreed to become Mrs. Harlow," Jackson announced, unable to keep the pride and joy from his voice. Frank's face split into a wide grin. "Well now, ain't that something? Though I can't say I'm surprised, not one bit." He stepped forward to shake Jackson's hand vigorously and then, with a questioning glance for permission, gave Beatrice a grandfatherly hug. "Couldn't be happier for you both. This place has needed a woman's touch for too long." "Thank you, Frank," Beatrice said warmly. "Your approval means a great deal to us." "Approval?" Frank scoffed. "Been pushing this stubborn mule toward the altar since the day he brought you home. About time he listened to reason." Jackson laughed, too happy to be offended by Frank's characterization. All right, we get the point. You're a matchmaking genius." "Just got eyes in my head is all," Frank retorted good-naturedly. "Well, I'll leave you two to your courting, though I reckon we've skipped straight to the engagement, haven't we?" After Frank had gone, Beatrice turned back to Jackson with a thoughtful expression. "We should write to Uncle William," she said. "Let him know my plans have changed." "Of course," Jackson agreed, though part of him feared her uncle might object, might try to persuade her that marriage to a rancher she'd known only weeks was a mistake. Beatrice seemed to read his thoughts. "He'll be happy for me, Jackson. All he's ever wanted was for me to find security and happiness. I've found both with you." They composed the letter together that very night, sitting side by side at the small desk in the parlor. Beatrice wrote most of it, explaining her change in plans with a quiet confidence that reassured Jackson. When she signed it, she included a postscript inviting her uncle to visit as soon as he could manage the journey, to meet the man who would become her husband. "When shall we be married?" she asked as they sealed the envelope. "I don't need anything elaborate." "As soon as you like," Jackson replied. "Though I'd want to give you a proper wedding, not just a hurried ceremony at the justice of the peace in town." Beatrice considered this. What about here? At the ranch, under that beautiful cottonwood tree, with the Thompsons and Frank and anyone else you'd like to invite. The image appealed to him deeply, Beatrice becoming his wife in the place that meant most to him, surrounded by the land that would be their shared legacy. That sounds perfect. And perhaps your uncle could come for the ceremony. I'd like that, she agreed. It would mean waiting a few weeks for his reply and then his journey, but I think it would be worth it. I'd wait however long necessary, Jackson assured her, though the thought of delaying their marriage pained him. As long as I know you'll be mine in the end. She leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. I already am yours, Jackson Harlow. The ceremony will just make it official. The weeks that followed were among the happiest of Jackson's life. With their future decided, Beatrice blossomed even further, taking on responsibilities around the ranch with enthusiasm and competence. She began to learn to ride, insisting that a rancher's wife should be able to handle a horse on her own, and proved a quick study despite her initial nervousness. Word of their engagement spread quickly through the small community, bringing visitors bearing congratulations and gifts, jars of preserves, hand-sewn linens, practical items for their shared home. Jackson watched with pride as Beatrice charmed everyone she met, fitting seamlessly into the social fabric of frontier life. Uncle William's reply arrived 3 weeks after they sent their letter. It was brief but heartfelt, expressing genuine pleasure at Beatrice's news and promising to arrive in time for the wedding, which they had tentatively scheduled for the first Saturday in September, just over a month away. As the day approached, preparations intensified. Beatrice, with Martha Thompson's help, sewed a simple but elegant wedding dress from fine muslin ordered specially from St. Louis. Jackson, not to be outdone, commissioned a new suit from the tailor in town and even submitted to a proper haircut. The ranch itself was transformed under Beatrice's direction. Flowers from the small garden she had expanded were arranged throughout the house, new curtains hung at the windows, and the yard cleared and prepared for the gathering that would follow the ceremony. The night before the wedding, with Uncle William safely arrived and staying in the guest room, Jackson found Beatrice sitting alone on the porch, gazing at the star-filled sky. Having second thoughts, he asked lightly, though a part of him feared her answer. She turned to him with a smile that dispelled his concerns instantly. Not a single one, just marveling at how life can change so completely in such a short time. He sat beside her, taking her hand in his. For the better, I hope. Beyond anything I could have imagined, she assured him. When I started that journey to Silverton, I was desperate, Jackson, alone with few prospects and little hope. Now, she gestured around them at the ranch, the land, the life they were building together. Now I have everything I never knew I wanted. As do I, he said softly. You know, when I found you that day, collapsing in the dust, all I thought I was doing was helping someone in need. I had no idea I was finding the other half of my heart. Beatrice leaned against him, a now familiar and cherished gesture. It's strange to think that if my driver hadn't abandoned me, if my wagon wheel hadn't broken, if you hadn't happened along that particular trail at that particular moment, we might never have met. I don't believe that, Jackson said with sudden conviction. I believe we were meant to find each other one way or another. This was just the path that brought us together. A romantic cowboy, she teased gently. Who would have thought? Only with you, he admitted. Only ever with you. They sat together in companionable silence, watching as a shooting star traced a brilliant path across the heavens. Tomorrow, they would be husband and wife, beginning a shared journey that would last a lifetime. But tonight, in this peaceful moment under the vast prairie sky, They were simply two souls who had found in each other the home they had always sought. The wedding day dawned clear and warm, a perfect September morning. Jackson, banished from the house early by Martha Thompson, and the other women who had come to help Beatrice prepare, spent the morning with Frank and John, nervously checking and rechecking the arrangements for the ceremony and the celebration to follow. "Settle down, son," John advised with amusement. "Everything's ready and that girl isn't going anywhere except down the aisle to you." "I know," Jackson acknowledged, adjusting his collar for the dozenth time. "Just want everything to be perfect for her." "It will be," Frank assured him. "Because you'll be there waiting, and that's all she cares about." By mid-afternoon, guests had begun to arrive, neighboring ranchers and their families, the storekeeper from town and his wife, even Doc Miller, who had never been needed for Beatrice, but had become a friend during her time at the ranch. They gathered beneath the cottonwood tree, where simple wooden benches had been arranged facing an arch twined with late summer wildflowers. Jackson took his place at the front, Uncle William beside him in his role as both Beatrice's family representative and the man who would perform the ceremony, having been a justice of the peace in his younger days before seeking his fortune in silver. And then, as the soft notes of a fiddle played by one of the neighbors began, Beatrice appeared on the porch of the house. Jackson's breath caught in his throat at the sight of her, radiant in her simple white dress, carrying a bouquet of prairie flowers. Frank, in his best suit, offered his arm to escort her to the ceremony, an honor that had brought tears to the old ranch hand's eyes when Beatrice had requested it. As she walked toward him, Jackson felt a sense of rightness so profound it nearly overwhelmed him. This woman, who had fainted in the dust before him just months ago, was now walking toward a future they would build together. The journey that had brought her to him had been marked by hardship and loss, but what lay ahead was full of promise and love. When she reached him, Frank placed her hand in Jackson's with a gruff, "Take care of her, boy," that made those nearby smile. "With my life," Jackson promised, meaning every word. The ceremony itself was simple but deeply meaningful. Uncle William spoke of commitment and partnership, of the special bond that forms when two people choose to face life's challenges together. When the time came for their vows, Jackson and Beatrice had each prepared their own words, a departure from tradition that felt right for their unique circumstances. "Beatrice," Jackson began, his voice steady despite the emotion welling within him. "When I found you on that trail, I thought I was offering shelter to a stranger in need. I didn't know I was bringing home the woman who would change everything, who would turn a house back into a home, who would fill empty spaces I didn't even know existed in my life and in my heart. I promise to love you, protect you, respect you, and stand beside you through whatever life brings our way. This ranch, this land, everything I have and everything I am is yours now and always." Tears shimmered in Beatrice's eyes as she began her own vows. "Jackson, you didn't just save my life that day, you gave me a new one filled with purpose and joy and love beyond anything I ever dreamed possible. You saw me at my weakest and still found strength in me. You offered not just your table but your heart, asking nothing in return. I promise to be your partner in all things, to make our home a place of warmth and welcome, to face both good times and hard with courage and faith. My heart, my hands, my future all belong to you, freely and completely." When Uncle William pronounced them husband and wife, Jackson drew Beatrice into a kiss that sealed their promises, heedless of the cheers and applause around them. In that moment, there was only the two of them and the life stretching before them, a life born from a chance encounter on a dusty trail but built on the solid foundation of genuine love and mutual respect. The celebration that followed was joyous and lasted well into the evening. There was food aplenty, music and dancing, and toasts to the bride and groom that ranged from heartfelt to humorous. Jackson watched with pride as Beatrice moved among their guests, her genuine warmth and interest in others evident in every interaction. "You've done well for yourself, young man," Uncle William commented, joining Jackson as he observed his new wife charming a group of neighboring ranchers. "She's a special woman, my niece." "That she is," Jackson agreed. "I still can't quite believe she chose me." William chuckled. "Having seen the way she looks at you, I have no such doubts. You've given her something she's never really had before, a place where she truly belongs." "And she's given me the same," Jackson replied. "Funny how life works sometimes, isn't it? If her wagon hadn't broken down, if I hadn't ridden that particular trail that day." "Some might call it chance," William mused. "I prefer to think of it as providence." As the evening drew to a close and guests began to depart, Jackson sought out Beatrice, finding her bidding farewell to the Thompson family. "Mrs. Harlow," he said, still savoring the sound of her new name, "may I have the honor of escorting you home?" She turned to him with a smile that made his heart skip. "You may indeed, Mr. Harlow. After all, it's your home too." "Our home," he corrected, taking her hand in his, "now and always." As they walked together toward the house, their house now in every sense, Beatrice paused to look back at the land stretching around them, bathed in the silver light of a rising moon. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "All of it." Jackson followed her gaze, seeing their ranch through her eyes, the sturdy buildings he had built with his own hands, the fertile fields, the distant silhouettes of grazing cattle. But most beautiful of all was the woman beside him, his wife, the unexpected gift life had brought him when he least expected it. "Yes," he agreed, drawing her close. "Beautiful beyond words." Together they entered their home, leaving the door open to the gentle prairie night, stepping forward into the shared future that had begun the moment a cowboy saw a woman faint in the dust, carried her home, and fed her from his own table. 5 years later, the Harlow Ranch had prospered beyond Jackson's most optimistic hopes. New buildings had been added, the herd expanded, and the house itself enlarged to accommodate their growing family. Beatrice had given birth to a son, William, 3 years earlier, and their daughter, Margaret, had arrived just 10 months ago, on a warm summer evening, much like the one when Jackson had first proposed. The family gathered on the expanded porch of their home. William, a sturdy 3-year-old with his father's dark hair and his mother's blue eyes, played contentedly with wooden animals Jackson had carved for him. Baby Margaret slept peacefully in Beatrice's arms, one tiny hand clutching her mother's finger even in sleep. "They're growing so fast," Jackson observed, his voice filled with wonder and pride. Beatrice smiled, the same radiant smile that still had the power to take his breath away. "They are. Soon William will be old enough to start learning the ranch properly. He already insists on helping Frank with the horses every chance he gets," Jackson chuckled. "The old man's patience with him is something to behold." "Frank adores them both," Beatrice said. "As do Uncle William and the Thompsons. Our children are surrounded by love." Jackson reached over to stroke his daughter's downy head. "As they should be. As we all are." Beatrice's free hand found his, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that had become second nature over the years of their marriage. "You ever think about that day, when you found me on the trail?" "Often," Jackson admitted. "Especially when I ride that route. I always slow down at that spot, remembering." "What do you remember most?" she asked curiously. He considered the question. "The fear at first, seeing you collapse and not knowing if you would survive. Then later, the way you looked at me when you first opened your eyes in our guest room." There was such trust there, even though I was a complete stranger. Not a stranger, she corrected softly. Just someone I hadn't met yet. Jackson smiled at her distinction. And you, what do you remember? Heat, dust, desperation, she said honestly. Then coolness, safety, your voice, though I couldn't make out the words at first, and when I finally could see clearly, your eyes so concerned, so kind. She paused, gazing out at the land that had become as dear to her as it was to him. I remember thinking, even in my confusion, that I had never felt so cared for. You were half delirious, he reminded her with a gentle tease. Perhaps. But I was right, wasn't I? She looked back at him, her expression soft with love accumulated over years of shared joys and challenges. You've cared for me for us every day since. And you for me, he acknowledged. For all of us. William abandoned his toys and came to lean against his father's knee, looking up with curious eyes. Tell the story, Papa, the one about Mama. Jackson laughed, lifting his son onto his lap. Again. You've heard it so many times. I like it, the boy insisted. It's the best story. Beatrice smiled encouragingly. It is a good story, and it's how our family began after all. All right then, Jackson agreed, settling his son more comfortably. It happened on a day much like today, hot and bright under the summer sun. I was riding home when I saw something unusual on the trail ahead. As Jackson recounted the tale they all knew by heart, Beatrice watched her husband and son with a heart full of gratitude. The path that had led her here had been unexpected and at times frightening, but it had brought her to exactly where she was meant to be. When Jackson finished the familiar story, William clapped with delight. And then you got married and had me. That's right, Jackson confirmed, ruffling the boy's hair affectionately. Though there was a bit more to it than that. The best parts of the story are still being written, Beatrice added, gently rocking Margaret as she began to stir. Every day with each of you. As the sun began to set, painting the prairie in hues of gold and amber, the Harlow family remained on their porch, together and complete. From the darkest moment of Beatrice's life alone, abandoned, collapsing in the dust of a lonely trail, had come this. A home filled with love, a family bound by choice as much as blood, a future rich with promise. And it had all begun with a simple act of kindness, a cowboy who saw a woman in need and offered not just shelter and sustenance, but ultimately his heart and his life. In the vastness of the western frontier, where distances were measured in days and human connections were precious, they had found in each other the greatest treasure of all. A love that had transformed them both, that had built a home where once there was only a house, that had created a family where once there had been solitude. As night fell and stars appeared in the velvet sky above, Jackson and Beatrice Harlow looked at each other across their children's heads, sharing a smile that held 5 years of memories and the promise of many more to come. I love you, he mouthed silently. And I you, she replied in kind, now and always. In the gentle darkness of the prairie night, their love born of chance, nurtured by choice, strengthened by years together, shone as steadily and surely as the stars overhead, a beacon of hope and happiness in the wild and beautiful land they called home.